There's a lot of speculation going around that the PBA and USBC are considering a urethane ban in the near future, and USBC recently issued a statement that will break down about the subject, considering the issues that we've had for years over the topic, the dominance of urethane on tougher conditions, and the fact that we've had no new urethane releases since very early last year. All signs seem to be pointing to a partial or full ban being a reality, so we'll talk through the situation here and see where we end up. Once again, this is more of a podcast style of a video. It's nothing you really need to watch. I do have one graphic that'll pop up, but I will let you know when that happens. I'll also apologize now if I repeat myself several days, as more people have contributed their thoughts and other information to the discussion. First of all, it's hilarious to me that what was outdated technology 40 years ago at the advent of reactive balls is all of a sudden not just relevant, but dominant on virtually anything tough. Today's urethane isn't exactly the same ankle that you may not have considered. I learned some things there, and we'll touch on that in a minute. But old urethane making a comeback is the reason that we have new urethane. The purple hammer has been the major bone of contention for it. It's pretty single-handedly negated the intended challenge of virtually any kind of tougher condition, long and heavy or short and light. It doesn't really matter to the purple. Usage is even more prevalent overseas, and even with the PBA's higher hardness proclamation, the black hammer is still dominating. Motive has their microcell polymer, but their reactive stuff is on the smoother side to begin with, so their pros I'm not really sure miss urethane. And while Storm had stronger contention with the pitch black, that's really the only top-tier urethane ball they've made in recent memory. The IQ78 has its moments, but the general consensus is that if you can drill a purple or a black, those are the balls to have. I don't think a full ban from USBC is likely, or at least I didn't before seeing their statement. I think if we do get one, it'll probably be something like the soft ban storm balls a few years ago. It'll be relegated to junior gold, the PWBA, Open Championships, the Masters, and the US Open, and it'll be a starting in August 2027 kind of thing. USBC hasn't wanted to be in the business of disturbing the regular members too much. And again, if you're just a regular league bowler, this might be another one of those who cares and why are we talking about this stuff kind of topic, like a lot of the other recent videos I've done, because it really doesn't affect regular league bowlers much unless you happen to throw urethane or maybe use urethane for spares. The PBA hasn't put anything out there yet, but it's heavily rumored they're involved as well. And with them already raising urethane hardness and finding that to be somewhat ineffective, I'm betting a full ban comes down the pipes for them starting January 1st of next year. For the general public who buys the equipment, it's a lot bigger deal than it is for pros who just wouldn't get to use those balls anymore. For you to be told you can't throw something or several things you've spent hundreds of dollars on, that's a whole different deal. But urethane usage isn't quite the major problem for league bowlers and weekend warriors that it is at higher levels. It's just more of an annoyance than anything. So I'm going to go on ahead and read USBC's statement, and then we'll talk because it's wild. I've linked it below if you want to take the poll too, but there's some people that have gone through it and says it's ridiculous anyway. So over the past several months, USBC has conducted research, engaged a third-party working group of technical experts and key stakeholders, and held a formal comment period with bowling ball manufacturers to address concerns about urethane bowling balls and their impact on competition. USBC's concerns are as follows. Lane pattern integrity. Urethane balls can alter lane patterns more quickly, disrupting the intended lane pattern design and creating imbalances between different styles of players. Competitive fairness. When urethane and reactive equipment are both used in the same competitive environment, it causes competitive imbalances between different styles of bowlers. Player development concerns. Increasing reliance on urethane may reduce player versatility and hinder long-term skill development, particularly among younger and developing athletes. Governance and integrity challenges. Urethane balls can measure softer over time, making it difficult to distinguish between natural aging and tampering. These issues have contributed to protests and confusion at events, creating enforcement challenges and questions around competitive integrity. USBC's next steps include continuing to evaluate this matter, blah, blah, all kinds of nonsense. This is one of the dumber things I've ever read from several angles. It's ignorant, it's hypocritical, it's significant overreach. There's just all kinds of things to get after there. First, we're going to talk about lane pattern integrity because there is a point there. And a well-known name in the industry is Jerry Kessler, who had something very interesting to say about old urethane and specifically old oil versus what we have going on right now. So here's his post pertaining just to urethane and oil. Don't worry, I won't forget to cover the hypocrisy. I'm going to go ahead and pop. He's got a graph that I'm going to go ahead and pop up. For those that say that urethane was used in the past, that's correct. However, the oil used at the time evaporated. Today, the oils are all 100% solids. Until modern stripping machines were used, the oil needed to evaporate. I've attached a chart. The oils used at the bottom of the chart were 501, 511, and 8001. While carry down existed, it's not like the carry down of modern times, and it evaporated. Typically today, we use between 22 and 30 mils of oil per lane. When urethane was used by all bowlers, we used 6 mil per lane, and the oil evaporated rather quickly. If you think urethane should be used, then we need to change oils and reduce the amount used per lane back to 6 mils. Edit. Century machines used for 6 mil used a carpet buffer that buffed oil into the lane. Today we use a brush that applies the oil by stippling. It's much thicker and results with much more oil on the ball versus 1985. So looking at this oil chart here, you can see exactly what he's talking about. Urethane wasn't always the urethane that we know today, and oils most definitely aren't either. Urethane carry down didn't used to be such a big deal, but as reactive balls got stronger, oils got heavier and thicker. So when using even new urethane that doesn't flare and doesn't absorb oil, such as N. Major, however, this turns a complete blind eye to how fast a 500 grit gem or mesmerized that flares 8 inches for a 500 rev rate will destroy a lane. The one saving grace is that when you transition a lane with reactive balls, typically, or sport type conditions, tougher conditions, typically the lanes open up and get a little easier, and then you can continue to move in with cleaner, weaker reactive balls. If you transition a lane with urethane, you're pretty well trapped in urethane because then you're left with pretty rough transition. However, with urethane, you can also stay in one spot for much longer. The ball hooks early, then it pushes oil down the lane on the back end so that you can just sit on top of that spot for several games and only have to move slightly to find fresh head oil. Ball hooks predictably, then it walks into the pocket. Urethane transition does happen faster, and when it gets ugly, you don't really have any way to fight it. But let's not forget the lofting Brooklyn Fest PBA shows last year where no one could get the ball down the lane or keep it on the right side of the head pin. Competitive imbalance. When both types of balls are used at the same time, it causes competitive imbalance between different styles of bowlers. If you have giant rev rates with 500 grit equipment destroying the lane, the straighter bowler has nowhere to go. Just like they have, once you get some carry down, they're not there. They don't have the power to get the ball to go through the pins the right way. But if you have giant rev rates destroying the lane, they can't exactly move in and play third or fourth arrow either. So, both styles can at least hit the pocket. With urethane, though, it allows straighter players to stay straighter. It actually kind of forces you to stay straighter with the carry down. And urethane also allows bigger rev rates to play straighter. Now, using reactive and urethane is, at the same time, is a problem, though. Urethane causes a lot of problems for reactive balls, but not really the other way around. And when you get carry down the lane, the lower rev rate bowlers or the lower power bowlers are going to need reactive balls to help them out, where urethane being more controllable helps the higher rev rate bowlers out. And reactive balls it takes a very, very small amount of oil to cause problems for reactive balls. So urethane carry down favors higher rev rates, and it really hurts. So it really hurts lower rev rates. So, but again, you're not going to see a stroker moving into fourth arrow and having any better of a time. So, the argument used for higher levels, though, is a lot more. J.R. Raymond has a bunch of great stuff out there about how this affects things on tour. Not that it's anything the average bowler, again, really cares about, but he's speaking from his experience or perspective at the level he's at. And again, that's the level that this whole issue is really aimed at. Player development concerns, and here's where it gets murky for me. They're worried that reliance on urethane may reduce versatility and hinder long-term skill development, particularly among younger athletes. Follow my train of thought here. Reactive balls get introduced 40-ish years ago. They start getting stronger, so everyone starts putting down more oil, and the oils start getting thicker. What do you do to combat that as a bowler? You use more surface. Rev rates go up. Bowling balls keep getting stronger. For some reason, the only way pattern designers could figure out to add more difficulty is more oil and flatter conditions, which just feeds right into that whole catch-22. But here's the quick caveat to that. USBC had 9 million members at one point, and what do business-minded people think when they see that? They think here's a money-making opportunity. Bowling manufacturers start popping up and developing equipment, and USBC does nothing about it, or ABC at the time, WIBC or YABA either, but ABC kind of drove the bus. So once you have manufacturers expanding and pro shops expanding, then you have distributors getting in the mix, and now you have significant monetization of the bowling populace. At a certain point after that, adjustments you make can significantly damage the greater industry, which has supported bowling more and more as they've grown and as USBC membership has shrunk. So making rule changes after the fact isn't that, after you've let the cat out of the bag, isn't that simple, because you've got large businesses employing thousands of people that your decisions are affecting. So to circle back around, obviously oil volumes going up back then and staying up now supports that industry. I think you can see where I'm going with this. So anyway, we keep going through this. Things keep chasing their tail. More oil, stronger balls, more oil, stronger balls, higher rev rates, first with no thumbers and palmers, then one hand isn't enough. We need two. But the problem here is that oil volume didn't go up everywhere, and the rev rate for the average bowler still isn't that high. Because realistically, Roth introduced the power game, or at least made it successful. So most of the power bowlers now are somewhat young. I'm speaking like 40s, 50s, and below. But a lot of the league bowling population is still kind of older. They grew up in the infant days of reactive, and even then, reactive balls help you hook the ball so that you don't necessarily need to focus on a big rev rate. It's helpful, and higher rev rates develop as you become more competitive. But if you just want to be a regular league bowler, you have all the big, strong equipment, and most league shots don't have that much oil on them anyway. That's why people are confused about all these strong balls that keep coming out. It's like, where is all this oil that people have to be able to use this stuff? However, if you bowl more competitively, which is where the issue is at, you generally are on a lot of oil in tougher conditions. The problem is that even heavily sanded reactive balls just aren't as smooth and controllable as urethane is. So urethane started coming back as an option to combat heavily oiled flatter patterns because it would hook early and then walk into the pocket. And then as it created carry down, it made staying on top of it and just throwing darts from the corner even easier. So this more controllable, straighter, and smoother option then allowed two-handers to really take off because there was no penalty for rev rate anymore. There for a while, rev rate helped most of the time, but it could still screw you over when the lanes got dry or when they were really flat. But now, with this new tool to use against heavier, flatter conditions for virtually everyone, it still benefited higher rev rates the most because it allowed them to just go full power and get rewarded for it. Now, over the years, nothing was done from a pattern standpoint. Nothing effective. Everyone just keep making them flatter and wetter, and the purple hammer kept running over everything. And then when the PBA slapped their hand with the 78 hardness rule, well, then here comes the black hammer, and nothing really changes. So you tell me what the real problem is here. You're telling me that one single piece of equipment is single-handedly defeating the entire industry. Competitive bowlers are conditioned to get the job done, which is to get the most pins. And if there's something out there that makes their job easier, they're going to use it. You are trained for years. Look for the hook, look for the hold, try to find the most miss room you can, get your ball through the pins right, get your surfaces right, try to find forgiveness or create it with transition. And when one piece of equipment does all that for you, you use that piece of equipment. It's not rocket science. You might also say then, well, if the one single piece of equipment is that overpowered and causes that much chaos at the same time, maybe it's unfair and maybe it should be banned. Just like reactive balls. Reactive balls can also alter the lane pattern quickly, which disrupts the intended lane pattern design and creates imbalance between different styles of players and sides of the lane. If you're at nationals and you have 9 righties all throwing 500 grit ASIMs and one lefty doing the same, it doesn't even matter what their specs or rev rates are. The conditions on the right will change significantly, and it'll be the end of the set before the lefty sees any significant difference. And this is why lefty-righty drama has gotten so much worse too. It doesn't matter how tough the conditions are. The righty plan is always stay out of trouble on the fresh, break the lanes down, and then score when they open up. The problem is on the left, they never open up. You either have a look to start or you don't. If you do, you can camp out and you'll probably have a better day than the righties. But if you don't, you'll never get any help. Meanwhile, the right side opens up and gets more scoreable. Better players have more of an issue with urethane because it creates transition that's much harder to deal with than reactive transition, and urethane carry down does in fact happen more quickly than track burn. With, again, as thick and heavy as the oil is, urethane will push that down very quickly, and it creates a problem where the heads burn up, but then the balls won't hook down lane. So you have to move in to get the ball down the lane, but then there's no reaction down lane, and it creates a situation where you don't have a legitimate chance to consistently score making quality bowling shots. It's more the luck of if you happen to throw the perfect shot to carry rather than anything consistent or realistically repeatable. You have all these hipsters that say, well, you just need to do better and figure it out or make better shots. But there's a limit on what's realistically humanly possible. And if the lane is wrecked with urethane and starts getting unplayable, there's no way around it. It's the same thing as some of these halftime show contests where they'll have somebody come out and try to hit a golf ball across the basketball court into the little hole in the board that's barely as wide as the golf ball. That's a 100% luck type of deal. You hit it in the right direction and hope you get lucky. Or it's like a slot machine tournament too. There is a certain point where things get so difficult that it's beyond the human. It's beyond human capability to be accurate or consistent enough for it to not just be a complete and total crapshoot. I'd say the same for reactive transition, but I think the pros would rather fight with bad reactive transition instead of bad urethane transition. However, people not being happy about something doesn't necessarily mean it's unfair or should be banned. Golfers would rather not play in rain or high winds either, but where do you draw the line between something that's just part of the game and something that shouldn't be? Is urethane the golf equivalent of a belly putter? I don't know, but if most of the players are in favor of banning it, I'd say there's something there, but all I've heard is completely divided opinions on the matter so far. So let's move on to the whole softness nonsense. I used to work in a federally funded testing lab in concrete research, so I know a few things about hardness. We did 8 zillion different hardness tests. There's something called overall in testing, though, there's something called standard deviation that's used to judge the consistency and reliability of a test. So basically depending on the amount of variables in any given testing method, some variables can be more controlled, so you get results in a very narrow range, and some tests just inherently have a lot more variables, which can give you a wider range of results. The durometer testing and the way they're doing it to measure hardness is absolutely ridiculous. The standard deviation is very high for that test, especially on spot checks at tournaments. It's so bad that it shouldn't be allowed to determine compliance of anything. I'm not necessarily saying that I don't believe urethane gets softer with age, and I'm not saying I do. There's people on both sides of the argument. I just think that there's a lot more things that go into it than that. Not to mention the 78 hardness black hammer is doing just fine, even though it's a freaking rock. So adjusting hardness hasn't really seemed to slow its effectiveness down. However, the main key thing here for me that really sways me in a certain direction is apparently there's been some tampering and cheating. And this is something that goes back a half a century. Urethane, when dunked in a bucket of acetone and soaked or otherwise chemically softened, gets significantly better. I've got a video linked in the description to a Creating the Difference video that Ron Hicklin made showing the wild difference between a soft purple hammer at like 62 and a legal hardness one, and it's shocking. Reactive balls don't get better when they're softened after being manufactured. They actually get significantly worse. So cheating after the fact isn't really an issue with reactive balls, but it's 100% a major issue with urethane, and it's virtually impossible to police. The resources and effort needed to do it accurately, effectively, and efficiently is beyond. It's just completely unrealistic. I have to say that I'm in support of banning urethane for just this reason alone, despite being a lefty who depends on it on tougher conditions, because that's a lefty thing, and I won't get into that in this video, but I think that's the key point for me that turns me that direction. I can see J.R. Raymond's points too when talking about he'd be in favor of it because it separates the high rev rates from the lower rev rates. And while there are a lot of other mixed opinions out there from people like Tom Doherty, Simo, Belmo, Walter Ray, and dozens of others, it's not in my court to decide what is fair and just part of the sport and what's over the line. Banning just urethane based on these ridiculous talking points, though, is absolutely insane. Their job is to govern the sport and take care of the rules, not basically say, well, we don't like how people are using strategy and intelligence to play the game, so we're going to put a stop to that. They're basically saying the game of bowling should be played a certain way, even if what's being done or the strategies being used are fully inside the rules, because they didn't do their due diligence decades ago to regulate technology. Now, I realize the current regime wasn't involved in those decisions decades ago, but when you're presented with the issues we have in bowling today, and the answer is just ban urethane, bowling's done. There's no way around it because all these problems that they listed applied to all the problems apply to reactive balls too. Reactive balls are the reason for the scoring boom in the first place because they made it so much easier for bowlers to score without having to develop any real skills. Nobody had to figure out how to manipulate a ball to get it through the pins right consistently like they did back then with weak balls with no cores that didn't drive through the pins on their own. Now people just buy 8 balls and flop them out there on walled up conditions and don't get lessons or work on their form or technique because they can just pull a different ball out of the bag that does all the work for them. But urethane, that's the real problem here. That's what's causing all these issues all by itself, even though it's almost completely relegated to the top few levels of competitive sport. I've said it before, but you know what solves all these issues all by itself? Dropping oil volumes. Dropping oil volumes takes care of transition because nobody's going to be throwing a ton of surface, and rev rate isn't great when everything's hooking off the planet. It reduces the left to right disparity. Being two-handed wouldn't be such a great thing anymore because everything would hook too much. You'd have to learn how to bowl and manipulate a weaker ball to get it through the pins the right way because it won't do the work for you. Banning urethane whacks one mole, and then we're still left with the same issues we've always had. People will just figure something different out, or the manufacturers will work around it somehow. There will still be two-handers everywhere, instead just rocketing short pin balls down the side, not doing anything different than they did with urethane. Big balls with big surface will still tear conditions up and destroy the intended pattern challenge. The lefties will still have the world one day and nothing the next. So banning urethane barely touches their complaints. The tampering or competitive integrity there is the one single thing that it really has, where urethane is a clear problem and reactive really isn't. All these other things apply to reactive equally, as far as I'm concerned. All it really is it's a scapegoat or a diversion or something to say, oh, look at us, we did something for the sport without really changing anything. Everyone is just mad that the purple hammer rules the world, and instead of actually doing something real about bowling to hit the reset button and get it going in the right direction again, so we're just gonna ban urethane. I don't necessarily disagree with banning urethane, again, because of what Jerry Kessler said, and especially because of the cheating and tampering concerns. But if it goes, reactive balls have to go too, because of USBC's reasoning, or it'll just be same shit, different day. If urethane is banned and no other adjustments are made, we'll know exactly what's going on. You can't, as a governing body, certify something like string pins because that was a 100% money decision that has nothing to do with integrity or progressing the sport, and then ban urethane under these given reasons, do nothing else, and still honestly say that you're governing the sport with fairness and integrity in mind. At that point, it's simply a market adjustment against a dominant piece of equipment from one brand that's hurting sales and performance for other brands and their staffers because they can't come up with anything to compete with it. Again, if urethane is banned and no other adjustments are made, we'll know that money rules bowling, and this will be the last hope of USBC ever making a positive change to improve bowling and help it recover. It'll just be a focus on bleeding and manipulating the membership for as long as they can drag it out. Thanks for watching, and may the strikes be with you.